Hello, and welcome to Mental Health Matters podcast. I'm your host, Liz Lang, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Burton. In this podcast, we will talk about all things mental health. Thank you so much for joining us. Hey guys, Liz Lang here with Dr. Mark Burton, and this week we are going to get into self-boundaries. So I'm going to start by explaining what a self-boundary is, and I think the best way is just to give an example. So an example of my self-boundary is I don't do schoolwork on Sunday.
Okay.
So it's just basically a boundary that you set for yourself. So it's a limitation. So I thought this was pretty appropriate to talk about as we're getting into the New Year's and people are starting to maybe set some New Year's resolutions. And so we'll talk a little bit about motivation and, dopamine, and we'll get into kind of those kinds of things. But as I was thinking about self-boundaries and what my self-boundaries are, I realized that a lot of them for me kind of surround my religion and my religious practices. But what these self-boundaries have done for me, they have enabled me to master impulses and to really set a routine. And it just helps me to be a more well-rounded individual, right?
Mhm.
And so, these self-boundaries are really, I guess you might just call it about self-regulating and, accomplishing goals and feeling good about yourself and feeling good about what you're trying to do. And a really important part of self boundaries is not shaming and not beating yourself up when you break a self
Right.
boundary, right?
Right.
That's going to be an important part. So what are your
And
thoughts
so
on self boundaries?
I agree with you as far as that can be one part of self boundaries. I think another piece is how we are in relationships with others.
Mm,
What are our expectations about how people treat us,
mm-hmm,
and because we've probably all had associations with people who maybe aren't very nice or they don't treat us well, and so you have to decide: am I going to put up with this? Do I say something? Do I end the relationship? Uh, and so again, I think the self boundaries is what are my expectations of how people relate to me out in the world.
mm-hmm.
Now, you can also do that, say, in the workplace, although that gets to be a little bit harder,
Yeah.
as we've talked about many times. The power differential is different within the workplace. I think that what I thought about this is really a good follow up to what we talked about last week with teens and boundaries, because I
Mm-hmm.
don't know if listeners remember what I was saying is last week is that as parents, when we set boundaries with our children, what we're doing is we're teaching them what is it like to be able to set boundaries for yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that sometimes I've seen this in working with people in my office that sometimes people do not have good boundaries with others. They
Mm-hmm.
let people walk all over them, that type of thing. And I believe that they didn't learn, in the home growing up or as teenagers, how to set boundaries for themselves or how to say, this is my expectation. See, I think as parents, when we say to our kids, this is my expectation of you, you're actually modeling for them
Mm-hmm.
how they might be able to do that when they leave your home and they're in relationships. They then can have expectations of others and how they treat them for an intimate relationship,
Mm-hmm.
just friends and things like that. So I think it's really important as parents that we do that with our kids, because then they can learn to do that for themselves, which is what we're talking about.
Yeah. So here's another self boundary that I have set. And again, this falls around religion. So, part of my, I guess you might call it daily routine that is important for me, that just helps me with my overall well being, is a religious practice. And my religious practice is saying prayers and scriptures, right? And so
Hmm.
again, this is just personal to me. And in the hustle and bustle of the morning and my kids and everything, sometimes it's hard to fit that in. And so a self boundary that I have set, and this has worked for me, and sometimes this can be called an anchor to help you remember, is before I eat breakfast, I make sure that I accomplish those things. So
Hmm.
before I eat breakfast, I will say my prayers and do my scripture study. And it's just a way to remind myself, okay, I need to get this done beforehand. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but what you're doing is you're creating either a routine or a structure
Yeah. Hmm.
to your morning, which I think, or, it doesn't, it for you, it's your morning. It doesn't have to
Hmm.
be that. But I
Yeah.
think as our listeners think about, it is the new year, lots of times you're setting New Year's resolutions. You know what the most common New Year's resolution, of course, is going to be either around what we eat or how we
Hmm.
exercise.
Yep.
And so I think there are some things to remember if some of our listeners are doing that. I think you have to do like one at a time, one or two at a
Hmm.
time. I don't overwhelm yourself
Yeah.
with, 'cause it's okay. I've got 5 different New Year's resolutions or 5 different things I want to set
Mhm.
to do every day. That's going to be overwhelming for anyone.
Yeah.
And so, one or two, but then following up on what you just mentioned is set a structure or boundary, and
Hmm.
you're going to be, or not a boundary, a routine.
Yeah.
Set a structure or routine, and you're much more likely to follow through to be successful on it if you're doing it, especially at the start.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, you've probably been doing this long enough that if something happened in the morning, you could probably pick up the prayer, the scripture study later on in the day,
Yeah.
because
Hmm.
life often intrudes and makes it so we can't follow through on the structure.
Yes.
But I
Yeah.
think once you create the habit, then I believe you can be a little bit more flexible
Hmm.
often with those
Hmm.
things. I think the same is true of exercise, what you do in the morning. Do you exercise before you get ready for the day? That type of thing. If you set that structure, it's easier to follow through when you can't. It's not about being rigid for one thing.
Right. Right.
I think it's about setting the structure and being flexible.
Yeah. And there's certainly been mornings where I've been really, really tired and I
Hmm.
overslept. I hit the snooze button instead. Now,
Yeah.
not that that was a great choice, but it happened. And
Hmm.
so I don't beat myself up over it. I say, well, there's tomorrow I can go back to it. And I think that's another important thing that people fall into. And I think this especially happens around exercise is this all or nothing thinking. At least
Hmm.
this is the trap that I fell into is all right, I'm going to exercise 3 days a week. And then I get to a point where it's like I'm not even going to get my 3 days in, so I'm just not even going to try. Well, even if
Yeah.
you only got in 1 day a week, that's okay. Don't just
Hmm.
completely give up. You got in 1 day, keep going anyways.
Yeah.
That was probably a biggest hindrance of for me in terms of starting a regular exercise is if I couldn't do everything, I wasn't going to do anything.
Hmm. And that all or nothing attitude is really interesting. I don't know that I think when we develop that, that's different for every person. I
Hmm.
mean, ultimately, the only thing I've ever read on it is, which I think we've talked about, is kids in school growing up. If you focus only on the A, like I want you to
Mm,
get an A,
yeah.
as opposed to the effort. See, this
Hmm.
this ties into what you just said, because if kids focus only on getting the A, then if they aren't going to get the A, then it doesn't matter because their parents are going to be disappointed. I might as well just get an F because it's going to be the same reaction,
Hmm.
right? If, however, parents, as your children are growing up, you focus on the effort,
Hmm.
it's an entirely different way to raise a kid. So then you don't worry about the grade, you just worry about did they work hard enough. So I think as you get an adult and you think of an exercise program, 3 times a week would be the A.
Yeah.
That's not really what you're after. You're just trying to make the best effort that you can,
Hmm.
which is what you're talking about. One time is the best effort I can make this week because of other things going on. So
Yeah.
I think as you teach kids to focus more on the effort growing up, they're more
Hmm.
likely to focus on the effort as an adult.
And I can think back to my childhood and see where that happened. And I can't remember exactly how or where it happened because, I wasn't a straight A student and my parents didn't penalize me for that. In fact, they knew how much I struggled with math. And so when I had a C in a math class, they weren't harsh about
Mm-hmm.
it, right? They said, okay, well, I know she's trying, but I can look back and I guess psychoanalyze, my childhood and think back to where, yeah, I did get a little bit of that all or nothing in maybe elementary school.
Well, and another place it can happen, and I don't know if this happened for you, it can sometimes happen in religious setting.
Mm, yeah.
You have to be this way to be good.
Mm-hmm.
and anything less, you're bad. See, that's the
Mm.
all or
Yeah.
nothing.
Yeah.
I think that mostly life is really about grays. I mean, there are clearly things that are right and wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but I think for most of us, there's this huge area in between that's kind of the gray area or the continuum. And so I think, again, it can happen in religious settings that,
Yeah.
if you don't go to church every week, or if you don't do something that is expected in the church, then you aren't a good person. That's an all or
Mm-hmm.
nothing uh,
Mm.
attitude, which can happen.
Yeah. And and now that I think about it, as I think back more, that sounds a lot like that makes me think of my dad. And I really hate casting my parents in a negative light in any way, because I love my parents and they were wonderful people and they gave me a wonderful childhood. Mark, you
But
really want
remember
to jump in?
what I've said about parents. I think the
Yes.
vast majority of parents do the very best job they can
And that fits my
all
parents
the
to a
time.
T. Yes.
Yeah.
But they made mistakes and I can definitely
Right.
and I think my dad maybe fell into that trap a little bit and maybe put that on me some. Is this all or nothing thinking? And so I guess parents with your own children, start focusing on the effort,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
It, I did this today with my daughter. She was making pancakes and she was like, "Oh yeah, look at this one. This one is a mess." And I said, "Well, that's okay. It's going to taste the same. You did
Hmm.
it." Right? And so it's okay if it's not perfect. It's about the effort, right? And so
Hmm.
really focus on, are your kids trying? Are they putting forth the effort?
See, I think this is a little bit, how sometimes we branch off and talk about other things, but I was listening to something the other day where they were talking about the importance of making mistakes
Yeah.
and how, again, as parents, we can teach our children, or even as children, about the importance of making mistakes. And I think even as adults, to realize it is okay and it should be expected that we're going to
Hmm.
make mistakes. And what you want to do is learn from the mistakes. And so, again, as a parent, if your child makes mistakes, you can say, okay, what did we learn from them?
Hmm.
And so you teach them that the mistake is about a learning opportunity. And then I think as an adult, it can be the same
Yeah.
thing.
Hmm.
We learn to, well, because what you're doing is you're learning to treat yourself kindly,
Yeah.
which is
Hmm.
what we need to do. So, when you sleep in and you hit the snooze button,
Yep.
instead of, being negative about yourself, that negative self-talk, if you've learned to say, okay, what can I learn from this? Do I go
Hmm.
to bed earlier? Do I, whatever it is, to make it so I can follow through next time? I think that's a really good lesson for us to teach our children.
Hmm. Right. And just knowing that you can start again. It's
Yeah,
okay to try again and again and again and again.
right. That's what the mistake is about. You can
Yeah.
try again. Well, let's
Yeah.
do this again. Let's try it
Yeah.
again. And you know what? We might make a mistake, but that's okay.
Yeah. And I can see where I fell into this trap as a kid, and as a youth. And really, we try to avoid religion, but this kind of ties back into my religious beliefs, and that
Mm-hmm.
is, and it's this idea of being truly repentant, right? As if you are truly repentant, you're not going to make the same mistake again.
Mm-hmm.
And that
Yeah,
really tricked me into that all or nothing thinking, because it's like, well, if I
right,
keep making the same mistake over and over again, then I must not really truly be repentant. I must not
right.
truly be sorry. And that's not the case, right? Because, I can think of something now that I do over and over again. I regularly overindulge in sweets. I
Uh
know that about myself, but it
yeah,
doesn't mean that I'm not trying, and it doesn't mean that I need to fall into this shame spiral, right? And so
right.
I think this is probably a good time to talk about guilt versus shame.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
that it's one of my favorite mental health topics, is because guilt is a very important healthy emotion, because guilt is your mind's way of saying I need to do something different.
right,
Shame is a very unhealthy emotion, because it's your mind is saying I'm bad, there's no hope, I can't do this, I'm the
right.
mistake.
I don't know if anything good comes from shame.
No.
Personally, I think a lot of good comes from guilt.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
because it helps us not uh, make those same mistakes again. I
Hmm.
was thinking about this story. I have heard this many times in a little bit different ways. So I think there might be some accuracy to it. And I don't know if you've heard of this Thomas Edison when he was designing the
Hmm.
light bulb. And he tried and tried and tried. And I don't know how many times that he tried, but there were hundreds of times that he
Yep.
failed. And
Mm-hmm.
someone interviewed him after, said, wasn't it hard that you had all these failures? And his response was, well, no, because now I know there are like 999 ways not to make that light bulb.
Yep.
And so he was, pointing out that he learned a lot from
Mm-hmm.
every time that he failed to come up with the light.
Yeah. So when you are creating a new self boundary, be kind to yourself, right? So the self boundary is probably all about trying to make a change, a positive change in your life, which is a good thing and something that everybody, I think, should always be doing. I think we should always be striving for positive change in our life.
Yeah.
And that's a
Yeah.
good thing. And so, use the guilt, let yourself feel guilt because you didn't succeed, but keep it of that mindset of, it was a mistake. I'm not the mistake. My action was a mistake, and I have the chance to try again next time. That's going to set you up for success. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk just briefly about motivation and dopamine and how that
Mm-hmm.
ties into this idea of, boundaries and why we do or don't do something.
Right. And, it goes back again to, I think we need to realize
Mm-hmm.
that there are a lot of physiological things that we experience that have a lot to do with our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a mistake that many people make is that they think, oh, I can. Now, I think this is hard because I think we do have total control over behavior. Again, Robert Sapolsky would say, no, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that maybe there's a middle ground somewhere
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
realize that you are going to be influenced by, say, in this case, a neurotransmitter, dopamine,
Mm-hmm.
or hormone. And so what happens, that reward system, and I know we've talked about this in quite a bit of detail before, but the idea that, so a lot of people mistakenly think that the dopamine is released once, let's say I want a chocolate chip cookie,
Mm-hmm.
and the dopamine is released once I have the chocolate chip cookie, and that's
Mm-hmm.
not the case. There's a little bit that is, but most of the dopamine is released with me thinking about it.
Yeah.
Or often the other way it can be released is if I see you eating this chocolate chip cookie that I think, oh my gosh, that looks really good. And I might even say, is that a really good chocolate chip cookie, Liz? And so this dopamine is being released in my brain. And so it makes it really hard to resist. Like if my self boundary might be, okay, I'm only going to have one chocolate chip cookie and I see the other one sitting there, the dopamine is going to start flooding because in anticipation of me eating that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the ways that you can counter that is you've got to interrupt that process. Best way is to do something else. I'm not saying that your desire for a chocolate chip cookie is an addiction. Oh, for some people it might be.
Mm-hmm.
But the way to interrupt any addiction is to try and do something else. Go for a walk, get out of the house, put the cookie out of sight. Or, if it's a drink, some people have trouble with alcohol. A lot of people are trying to cut down on alcohol. And the same thing applies. If you start thinking about, well, wouldn't that taste of whatever your alcohol choice is taste good, then the dopamine's going to start flowing.
Yeah.
So you just need to understand that there's a physiological response that we have that is normal, and then try and figure out a way, how do you counteract the influence of the dopamine? And I think the best way is, maybe, I don't know if it's the only way, it might be, is to remove yourself from the situation.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at a bottle of whiskey and your drink of choice is whiskey, get up, put the bottle of whiskey away, or get up and go on a walk.
Yeah.
And often just the fact of you getting up and doing something different for a time period, then what happens allows that dopamine to then settle. And so you don't have that same desire and that motivation.
And so I want to point out here that we are talking outside of the realm of addiction, because
yes, we are.
That's important to talk about, because if you are an alcoholic and you are addicted to alcohol, and that bottle of whiskey is there, it is like it's going to be so much harder to resist than if you are just trying to cut back and set a self boundary. So I think that's important to establish that there's a difference, because if you truly have an addiction, you need professional help, right?
Yeah.
And so that's not what we're talking about. Now, I think that's a good thing to bring up is, if you are trying to cut back on something,
Yeah.
right? But you don't necessarily maybe need to eliminate it, right? So maybe you are trying to cut back on your alcohol intake. That is a healthy self boundary, is just to
Hmm.
go into it saying, okay, I'm going to have one drink. And then a good way to help with that is to find somebody you trust to help you be accountable, right?
Hmm.
So maybe you're going to go to a party and you say to your spouse, okay, I don't want to overdo it, so I'm going to give myself a limit of 2 drinks. Will you help me with the accountability, right?
Hmm.
Will you help me with this?
So the other thing, again, a little bit off topic maybe, but because a lot of people this time of year are trying to cut down. But let's say, like I have a particular client who wants to really cut down on his cannabis use. The very first step is to monitor it, because often we don't, it's too easy to just get in the habit of taking a drink or using some cannabis. And so what I try and help people see is you've got to know how much you're taking first.
Yeah.
And I mean, if you want to do less and you have no idea how much it is that you're consuming, then
Hmm.
you need more information.
Yeah.
Um, so, keeping a log, I don't know of any other way to do this except to write it down, because if you try and keep it in your head, it doesn't work very well from my experience. And so you need to monitor what you're wanting to decrease. You need to know how much you have now.
I think it's also important to pay attention to why you are doing it.
Hmm. Sure.
Pay
Yeah.
to your emotional state anytime you're trying to cut back, because so many times we will use substances as coping mechanism, from food to alcohol to cannabis to
Yeah.
any sort of thing that you can ingest. Oftentimes we're using that as a coping mechanism without realizing it, to maybe stress, depression,
Right.
anxiety. And so, if you're going to start keeping a log, keep track of how you feel when you want it.
Excellent. Yeah, you're right. Again, I'm not making a moral judgment. I mean, I have
Right.
kids who drink, but anyone who wants to think about their alcohol consumption, go to Andrew Huberman on YouTube. His
Hmm.
episode on alcohol,
Hmm.
listen to it for about 15 minutes. It goes on for a long time, but within the first 15 minutes, it will probably change your attitude, because he is only talking about what alcohol does to your brain
Mm.
from a physiological standpoint. That's all. And he's not making a moral judgment either. He's just saying,
Yeah.
here's what really happens when you consume alcohol. As I listen to it, it's kind of terrifying.
Yeah.
Really, I don't drink at all, but I thought,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, it's really terrifying that people do this. So,
Well, I mean, you could say the same thing about what sugar and processed
right.
food
Yes.
does
Oh
to your
yeah. You're
brain.
right. You're absolutely right. Can we talk about a little bit about relationships?
Yeah.
Self boundaries in relationships, because I think this is really important as well.
Hmm.
I think that sometimes I've certainly had clients who do not have very good boundaries with their relationship,
Hmm.
and they are treated poorly or unkindly, or possibly there's abuse going on,
Hmm.
and it's often hard for people to pull out of the relationship. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with how we're raised, family of origin. And we
Yeah.
aren't going to go into a lot of that, but it's the idea that as we teach our teenagers, as we talked about last week, that they can set boundaries on how people treat them,
Hmm.
that in adulthood they'll do that. Because as an adult, we need to be aware of how our relationships make us feel.
Hmm.
And often we get those signals. You haven't mentioned it yet, but next week we're going to talk about anger,
Hmm.
which is, again, is an emotion. It's just sending you a signal. So if you find yourself getting angry in relationship, say with one person, that
Hmm.
is really good information. And
Yeah.
so listen to the information that your emotions are giving you. I think that's one of the reasons we've developed emotion over time, is that, over the tens of thousands of years that we've existed, because it really gives us, I think, good information about what our relationships are like.
Yeah.
And I think one of the problems is we don't pay enough attention to how we feel, or, if we're angry, if we're sad, or, in the context of emotions,
Hmm.
and realize that if the relationship is not healthy for you, you have the right to either set the boundary or end the relationship.
Right.
We can do that. And that is again, a self-boundary on how we're treated. Now, if the relationship is important to you, you can talk to the person and say, I don't like it when you treat me this way. I
Mm-hmm.
think you have to be somewhat specific and say, I would like you to change, and, give the person the opportunity to change. Where I run into this in my office is typically with couples and their extended family. And often around this time of year, we just came through the Christmas holidays, New Year's, there's a lot of family stuff going on. It's okay to set boundaries with how extended family treats you or your children.
Yes.
You do not need to put up with any behavior that you feel is inappropriate or not healthy. And
Yeah.
that, I think, is a good way to think about self-boundary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is the way you allow people to treat you. And, and that certainly falls into the category of boundaries with relationships. And I think a lot of that comes back to what you feel you deserve. How do you feel you deserve
Yes,
to be treated?
yes, right.
Right. And so ask yourself that is this person being disrespectful? And maybe even think about, well, why are they treating me this way? Have we already established the relationship of it's okay for you to treat me this way? And if you have, why have you allowed that? Why have you allowed this person to treat you with disrespect? What made you set that precedent? And then talk to them. And, similar to what we talked about last week of getting angry doesn't really help. I think the best way to address these situations is to calmly say, I don't like this.
Well, what you're doing is you're setting an expectation. I
Yes.
think you can even say, here's my
Mhm.
expectation. You don't
Yeah.
treat me this way. So much of what we talk about really overlaps because we're talking again about, I'm going to set an expectation and then the consequence. If you
Hmm.
continue to treat me this way, I'm not going to be your friend. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know that you would say it in those words, but,
Right.
the idea is I set the expectation and then I'm going to follow through with the consequence
Hmm.
because I'm going to set that self boundary.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, so I want to ask you a question that I meant to ask
Hmm.
at the beginning. Do you think it is harder to create boundaries with people, or do you think it's harder to create a boundary for yourself? Right. So, like around, I guess,
How do you mean? Like what I eat or drink compared
hmm
to how I'm treated?
yeah. What do you think is
I
easier?
I think they're about the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I would not put one easier or harder than the other. Again, I go back to what I said earlier is I think a lot of it is how we're taught growing up in our family. And sometimes you run into people who do not have a very good sense that they can set boundaries for themselves. And that
Mm.
includes what they eat, what they drink, how they exercise, and also how people treat them. Often they go together.
Okay. Yeah. See, and I think it's easier for me to set boundaries with people, but I'm also a very
Hmm.
blunt person and I'm not afraid to
Uh-huh.
tell it like it is. I'm not afraid to tell people what I think and how I
Yeah.
feel. So, setting a boundary with a person or saying to someone, I don't appreciate that behavior is easier for me than, say, cutting back on my sugar intake.
Mhm.
Right. But that's just me personally.
Okay. Okay. So here's one way to think about it. What's
Uh-huh.
your relationship like with sugar?
Ooh, it's
So,
not good.
th- but see, if you think about it in terms of it's not good, how does the sugar treat you?
Ooh, I love it.
No. Well, okay. A different question. I know you. I know you love it. What is the sugar doing to your body?
Ooh, it's giving me energy. It's giving me a high,
Oh,
right?
you're
It's
going
that
for the positive. Good for you.
but it's making me crash later.
um, no, it's just you can think about what I'm getting to is we often don't think about we actually have relationships with food and
We do.
substances.
Yeah.
It's just a little bit different way to think about the relationship.
It's a good
I
point.
mean, here's another way to think about it. There are some people who really go all out exercising,
Mhm.
right? Sometimes too much. I mean,
Yeah.
you can exercise too much where it's harmful to your body.
Yeah.
They have a relationship with the exercise where, in a sense, hard to verbalize, they're they're letting the exercise abuse them in a way,
Mm. Yeah.
right? Like they figure like if they just run, run and run and run, run, that turns out to be hard for their body.
Mhm.
Then the exercise in some ways abusing them. And I think so. You can think about things in terms of what is my relationship with the subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really good way to think about relationships or food. It's all about balance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because, your body needs food, it needs energy,
Right.
and it needs
Right.
sugar, right?
Right.
You do need some amount of sugar. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing to cut out processed sugar if that's something you decide to do, but your body will get sugar naturally. I mean, if you think of fruits is pure sugar.
Fructose, yeah.
Yeah, it's just pure fructose, but it's good for you, and your body does need that, and so it's okay to
Your
have
brain.
that.
Your brain.
Yeah, your brain needs it. So, biggest takeaway from today's episode is when you are setting a new boundary or you're trying to create a new structure, a new routine, be kind to yourself. I think that's going to lead you to the most success is if you can be kind to yourself and be forgiving of yourself when you mess up or when you don't do it perfect.
Right. And the takeaway I want to point out is you have the right to set boundaries or expectations and consequences in relationship. And I think that's an important thing for us to do.
Yep. You get to be in control of you.
Yeah.
Neurotransmitters are very powerful.
Dopamine. Right. Yeah. And they're giving us information. And so hormones and neurotransmitters, in this case, we're talking about dopamine, they're incredibly powerful. Yeah.
They are.
Realize that and accept it.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you're a bad person.
No.
It means you're human.
I mean, I'm getting dopamine hits right now. I'm about to go do a bike ride, and I'm looking that anticipation has got me excited.
But and so again, I mentioned the book Anna Lembke. She wrote a book called Dopamine Nation, which I think is really a good book, good read for anyone.
Yeah. Okay. So next week, our topic is going to be why anger. We're going to get into why anger is a valid emotion, why it can actually be a healthy emotion, and how to keep it a healthy emotion. Because anger can certainly get too big and be unhealthy, but anger is not a bad thing. And so we're going to get into all of that next week.
Right. It's not anger. It's what you do with the anger.
Exactly. Okay.
Okay.
Well, hey, there we go. Everyone. We can just skip.
That's it. That's right. It's what you do with it. So.
Yeah.
Have a good week, everyone.
Bye, guys. Have a question for Dr. Burton? How about a topic you'd like us to cover? Send us an email at mentalhealthpod21@gmail.com. This podcast was produced and edited by Liz Lang. Music is by Audio Lounge.